record.
Very stoic in nature, I think. Some of the stuff that he says about just having a kind of an understanding of finality.
Yeah, to some extent, although I don't want to spend too much time on Stoicism, but Heidegger might suggest that even the Stoic attitude about the eventuality of our death misconstrues the phenomenon of death by taking it as a simply distant and thus abstract actuality. So we all, of course, in an intellectual sense, at least I hope, recognize our finitude, our mortality, that is, that one day we will no longer be, that we will die. But usually we leave that understanding precisely in these abstract parameters. And for that reason, temporally, it's something that we project as an actuality that's simply not yet. So we can say, yeah, of course I'm going to die. But implicitly, always, even if we're not consciously saying this part of it, not yet. That's not for me now. So Heidegger, his idea is death as a phenomenon in terms of the role that it plays in human temporality. That is the way that death as a phenomenon temporalizes us. That is, constitutes our being in time is as a possibility, not as an actuality, whether now or distant, which means to really recognize the fact and the truth of one's status as finite. So to come to terms with one's finitude is to understand death as the ultimate and ownmost possibility that constitutes one's very being, one's very identity, that cannot be outstripped. So that recognition would involve the fact that you might die now. You could die a second from now, right? So it's an always present possibility. And once we understand our finitude, we can start to singularize ourselves, because it's through the confrontation with death as one's ultimate, most authentic possibility that one becomes the individual that one is. Otherwise, we're more or less distributed along lines of das Man, or the they self. So for example, as a professor, I'm more or less anonymous. I'm interchangeable in this role or capacity in an important sense with any other professor, right? So if I suddenly were to die and I had to be replaced for these last 2 weeks by someone else, I would at least hope that you might be a little bit sad. But in any case, the class would still proceed as a class does. And just as if all of you were suddenly replaced with entirely new students, I would be confused and a little sad, but the class would go on, right? Because the functional components for this very process and structured activity are in place. And the same goes for your intimate or familiar relationships. So the way in which someone is a good mother or a good son or daughter or a good brother or a good boss or a good employee or whatever else, these are all more or less publicly defined and normative, such that if you're a good father, brother, child, boss, or whatever else, then you are precisely interchangeable or replaceable by anybody else who is a good father, mother, child, sister, brother, and so forth, right? But it's only in death that one becomes an individual. So death is the one thing that constitutes the selfhood of the self that cannot be anonymized, that someone cannot be a representative for you for. And so it's in grappling with the fact of one's own finitude, one's own impending death as an always already possibility that one becomes a singular individual, that is to say, an authentic individual. So authentic meaning identic eigentlich, in the German, which means own most. So Eigentlichkeit is what's translated from the German to authenticity, but authenticity sounds a little cold and unusual. But Eigentlichkeit is just own most. So what is mine and only mine, what is peculiar to me and nobody else, is the relationship that I have to my own death. But we typically find ways in our everyday social lives to evade facing our impending death straight on as an always occurring possibility. So we distract ourselves from that. And art, it seems, to bring us now to the question and problem of art, can be one human mode of being in which that common and almost guaranteed effort of distraction and abstraction is dissolved to perhaps facilitate a more authentic, a more, in terms of one's being, own most relationship to finitude or death. But does that make sense? Okay. I'll just interpret your silence as not just Schweigen, but Schweigen, which is another important concept from Heidegger's Being and Time. Schweigen is normal silence. Schweigen is like a productive silence, a pregnant, disclosive silence, which really tells you something. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pull up my slides and we'll just start working through this. And so most of our time today will be spent on clarifying the very nature of a thing, of what it means to be a thing. But I mean, why do we start there? So does anyone remember, like in your own words, why do we have to talk about things? Because this is something that nobody else has done, no other philosopher has done in our reading thus far this term. We haven't yet had to spend time unpacking the very status of the thing, the very concept of thingliness. So what is it about works of art, in whatever medium, whatever genre, what is it about works of art that Heidegger thinks brings us into a necessary dialogue on the problem of thingness or thingliness?
This might not be entirely correct, but I think he's trying to get at the fact that works of art aren't the same as mere things, like there's something more to them than just their physical being. And so in order to understand what a work is and understand the component of them that goes beyond what a thing is, you have to first understand what a thing is so that you can then sort of pile on top of that and figure out what a work is.
Good, good. So that's sort of on the right track, I would suggest. So you're right to point out that he distinguishes mere things from things in a less qualified sense as natural objects, like a rock in a field or a clod of earth or something like that. That is something that has presence, that appears before us, that manifests itself for experience, but which was not created by anyone in particular. It's not an artificial object. And it also doesn't seem to necessarily serve any immediate use value. So that's how he distinguishes thingliness in general from mere things. So then why is he still, though, talking about a work of art? Because even if, and we saw this especially with Hegel, right? So a work of art, unlike a natural object, so the product of natural forces, has spirit in it. And spirit operates within the aesthetic domain by appropriating what Heidegger is thus describing as a mere thing and transforming it. So introducing something to it, that is spiritualizing it. So spirit externalizes itself in the sensuous materiality of mere things, and thus reflect spirit back to itself. So that's sort of the standard move in the history of aesthetics, to begin with mere thingness, and then to attach further conceptual layers or distinctions on top of that. And there's something problematic about that, because Heidegger will argue that the very definition of thingness, the truth, I should say, the reality of what it means to be a thing in general, gets obscured through the appropriation of these metaphysical concepts, which in his own language amount to a kind of assault on the things in themselves, on the very phenomena that we're trying to allow to show themselves in terms of what they are. But in a real simple way, well, we have to confront art objects as things because they are things. Whether you're talking about a painting, whether you're talking about a musical recording that's stored on a vinyl record or a CD, or even an MP3 file, which, although a digital object, is nevertheless material in some traceable sense, right? So we're always dealing then in some level with things, although we think that the artwork as work goes beyond mere thingness. And so there's an undeniable thing quality to works of art. But Mack is precisely right, though, what he said. To understand what's different about works of art versus their status as mere things, the highest level of abstraction, in which case, as he suggests, a chair, a human body, a coffee cup, a bird, a planet, a star, even that which doesn't show itself at all, even that which is non-appearance, such as a Kantian thing in itself, we understand all of these things to be things. So that's sort of what motivates that initial question, which takes up the bulk of our assignment for today. So hopefully that makes some sense. But I really love this picture, this grumpy Heidegger photograph there. I actually have that picture on a t-shirt. And under him, there's a caption that says, thrown into being, which makes it even funnier. But as I've mentioned before, so Heidegger is considered arguably, along with Ludwig Wittgenstein, so it's usually Heidegger and Wittgenstein that are considered the most important philosopher of the 20th century. And many movements and trends within 20th century and now 21st century philosophy are entirely or to a large extent indebted to Heideggerian phenomenology and ontology. So existentialism, like I taught last term, phenomenology, hermeneutics, which is, and there's some hermeneutics going on here, and I'll call attention to where that is. Hermeneutics is the science or study of interpretation. So initially, as a discipline, it was the science behind how to interpret biblical scripture as a source of truth that's nevertheless historically distant from us, such that it might be impossible to arrive at the true trans-historical meaning because of the intervening epochs and the various transformations that have occurred have put us at a greater remove from these scriptural sources. But now it's used much more broadly within philosophy as the study of interpretation, and it's sometimes presented as an alternative to epistemology, such that for hermeneutic philosophers like Heidegger, we can never arrive at certain knowledge, say in the Cartesian sense or even the Thomistic sense, referring to figures like St. Thomas Aquinas, whom Heidegger mentions a couple times in our reading. Rather, what we understand or characterize in terms of knowledge, we arrive at through various interpretations. Okay. And post-structuralism, deconstruction, postmodernism, within environmental philosophy, deep ecology, Now, more recently, the movements of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology are these nascent philosophical movements, which are not entirely, but to a large extent indebted to Heidegger. So Graham Harman is the famous philosopher, contemporary philosopher behind object-oriented ontology. Harman, it's a different spelling than my name. It's Harman. And I actually brought him to campus last quarter for a campus theme talk. It was very interesting. Well, I didn't bring him to campus. Brought him virtually to campus through a Zoom event. But it's important to note here that his reputation is tarnished because of his active involvement with the Nazis. And he became an official member, a card-carrying participant of the regime in 1933. And because of this, at the close of the Second World War, by the Allied powers, the occupying powers, he was barred from his official teaching activities because of his complicity with the Nazis. And he wasn't reinstated as a professor emeritus until 1951. And this is a huge ongoing controversial area within 20th century continental philosophy. So some think that Heidegger should be ignored, his status should be entirely dismantled, and his reputation should be reversed. And we should just stop reading him. But others, to take the opposite extreme, think that his political commitments, as horrible and misguided as they were first of all short-lived, and then secondly can be meaningfully decoupled from his work in metaphysics and ontology and aesthetics and so forth. But I'm of the mind that the best path is somewhere between those two extremes. It's impossible, even if we would like to, dismiss his thought entirely, just because of the way in which his influence has insinuated itself into all sorts of disciplines. And I even left out computer science, actually. He's been influential in computer science and making us rethink the possibility of artificial intelligence, because he makes us rethink what intelligence is, very interestingly. So there are cognitive scientists working within a kind of Heideggerian framework right now. Okay. Now, Being in Time, Sein und Zeit, which was published in 1927, is considered his magnum opus. It's out of his work, not exactly my favorite. I prefer Heidegger's later philosophy. But in it, he opens up his lifelong pursuit of the question of being, which he argued had been effectively forgotten, rendered into oblivion since as early as Plato. Right? So Heidegger thinks that we have to return to the pre-Socratics in order to overcome this sort of forgotten ossification of normative concepts, which we now take for granted. So ossification, the status of something hardening to the solidity of bone, such that these concepts are not lenses or pathways or openings through which truth manifests itself, but are simply the way things are. And so he wants to sort of push back against that. Let's see. So he thinks that we've forgotten being with a capital B in favor of beings, this or that being, whose meaning or intelligibility or sense or significance we take for granted as a simple matter of course. But he thinks that there is a moment of decision in which historically beings are compelled or set up in advance to show themselves, to present themselves, to manifest as what they are in a reductive accordance with a particular prescribed set of limited meanings. Such that when something even presents itself for your conscious perception or experience, before your thought, your analytical or critical thought can even go to work, the meaning has already been disposed for you. And that is not something ahistorical. That's something that has been shaped and changed and pushed through this or that various pathway in the broad historical lineage that we've all traced from antiquity to the present. Let's see. Okay, so for example, and for this reason, I would certainly argue that Heidegger is perhaps the first philosopher of the Anthropocene. So before that term was even coined, and it was coined by, well, it wasn't coined by Crutchen, but Paul Crutchen, so he's a natural scientist, a chemist, who put the word into broad currency just a couple decades ago. But I think you've all at least heard of the Anthropocene, but it's the purportedly new geological epoch in which we all find ourselves, in which case the human being, the anthropos, exerts a decisive influence over the various geological and natural systems and processes, such that the sedimentary layers, in fact, from decades and decades back, and they will be there for centuries and centuries into the future, reflect human presence and human interventions into these natural systems. So microplastics, for example, concrete and all that. And so the Anthropocene now is such that the human is set up to see himself or herself everywhere, all over the earth. And think about how this relates to Hegelian romanticism, right? So according to Hegel, history in itself, independent of art, philosophy, science, religion, as the primary modes through which spirit comes to realize itself, history itself is the very avenue towards freedom, which is self-consciousness of spirit, which we talked about this in Hegel, means that the human being comes to be at home everywhere. So the sort of strangeness, the intransigent hardness of material beings in the world are appropriated into the unfolding of spirit, such to become spirit itself, but externalized. So the human has insinuated itself everywhere. And Heidegger traces this all the way back to Plato, ultimately. But you can see it really profoundly manifested in that language in 19th century Europe. And so everything then, according to the contemporary mode of being, that is the mode through which objects or entities show themselves as what they are, is understood as a series of calculable forces that can be appropriated to serve human desires and ends. So one example that he uses, and that I have an image for as we go on, is like when a hydroelectric plant or facility was introduced to the Rhine River in the 1930s. Suddenly the Rhine River itself and the very water that constitutes it was turned into resource to be culled by human beings for the purposes of our own ends. And that's ultimately what technologos, what technological being is for Heidegger. It's a mode of revealing, or it's a mode of disclosure in which everything is presented as a means to the end of human telos, of human satisfaction. And thus everything is perfectly fungible or exchangeable. As objective being, everything is abstracted away from its singular presencing, ultimately then from its thingness, right? So when I look at this coffee cup, I'm not set up by this contemporary mode of understanding. I'm not set up to see this coffee cup as what it is, as an irreplaceable entity, as a thing. It's simply one coffee cup that I could instantly replace with another coffee cup, and its very being shows itself to me as disposable, which means I recognize it as garbage, ultimately, even as I'm using it, such that if I were to value this object and to put it on my mantle at home, or to keep it forever and ever, I would be relating to it in a really strange and inappropriate way, in accordance with the system of significances and meanings that I have come to occupy as the being that I am in the 21st century. So he uses this example in a later essay, The Question Concerning Technology, of an airliner that's sitting on the runway. So the adequate way in which that being shows itself as what it is to any person that would look at it is as a potential mode of transport from one point to the next, that's just waiting reliably for that to happen. It doesn't really show itself as a singular entity, irreplaceable. I can look at it that way, just as I suggested in connection to this coffee cup, but there would be something really weird about that. There would be something inappropriate about it, such that I'm really missing what the plane means if I took it seriously in its objective singularity as this physical object that demands to be engaged with or understood in a particular way. Okay, so does that make sense? I'm just kind of trying to draw a big picture overview of Heidegger's philosophy. Are there any questions about that? And so that also, in what I just said, gives you perhaps several hints as to the important role of art in Heidegger's thinking. And so let's do a little bit of background. So I am mindful of the time. I think instead of taking a break, we'll just get out 5 minutes early today, if that's acceptable for everybody. So we'll just leave here at 3:15 today. So this was actually composed over the course of a couple years in the mid-1930s, which it's also important to make clear was during the full swing of his kind of Nazi period. And for that reason, there's some language in here that makes me as a reader a little uneasy about, you know, strife and conflict and all that. Well, that really comes out in the second part of the reading. So pay attention to that on Thursday, although I think it's a little unfair, but the language itself is certainly a source of possible discomfort, knowing as we do these historical details. But I have a hermeneutic effort, so an interpretive tack that I take to kind of dispel that unease, as we'll see. Some figures to think with. So Heidegger is with this text in a sort of subtle way, without too much fanfare. He's challenging the entire history of aesthetics, beginning with Plato and culminating in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of fine arts in the 19th century. There's an implicit critique of Hegel in our reading for today, and there is a more or less explicit critique of Aristotle, and by extension, Plato. So he argues, as we'll see, and this is what we began with today, so that last paragraph of today's assigned reading, that every great work of art is a setting into work of truth, where truth is understood in the Greek sense of aletheia that we've talked about several times at this point, or unconcealedness, unhiddenness. So what is the truth? The truth is that which has been revealed. And importantly, the or in connection to that with the Greek etymology, the the privative, the negative, the and the negative is more primary. So for there to be unconcealment, unhiddenness, there has to first be the hidden. There has to first be the obscure. Now, remember we did talk about, in the context of Hegel's Romanticism, we talked about beauty as truth made vivid. So insofar as we're dealing with a work of art which manifests beauty, we could just say that we're following Hegel's metaphysical approach here with Heidegger, but Heidegger's doing something a bit different. So according to Hegel, artworks create beauty, and that beauty is the truth of an entire historical people that has been made vivid in a sensuous form. And this, by the way, is what Croce, although a neo-Hegelian, this is what Croce criticizes Hegel about at the end of that encyclopedia entry, when he says, if we take at face value this aspect of Hegel's aesthetic romanticism, then the very individual artists that we encounter in individual works of art from this or that historical moment become dissolved. Their specificity, their identities become erased in the overarching cultural milieu of which they're a part. And so Croce, like 20th century existentialists and 19th century proto-existentialists like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, is critical of Hegel for this reason, that he seems to obviate or render invisible the singular individual by just burying them in or subsuming them under the cultural milieu or the society in which they were working. And so Heidegger differs in this way. For Heidegger, artworks do not simply manifest a truth that is already there, and that, because remember, it's not just art that makes truth possible for Hegel, it's also found through religion and philosophy, which would include science too. So that means there is some sort of non-medium specific, non-disciplinary specific truth that is accessed perhaps in different ways, whether you're talking about art or religion or science. This is where Heidegger differs. Artworks don't simply manifest a non-disciplinary truth that's already there, but every work of art rather produces truth. It actively brings it forth. So remember poiesis. Poiesis is a bringing into presence, a bringing forth into being what was previously absent or non-existent. So works of art bring forth a truth poetically within this or that historical epoch by opening up and preserving an open region, a world in which things show up as meaningful in particular ways. So every work of art, thus, as opposed to being an object to be seen, although many works of art, if not all works of art, are that. We could expand seen with other sense modalities, being heard, in some sense being touched or whatever, although as we talked about with Hegel, that's not an aesthetic sense modality or category. But works of art, they're not about presenting us with material or physical things, objects to focus our various aesthetic senses on, but rather every work of art opens up a way of seeing the world. So they're kind of like prisms through which the very sense of the totality of being, the human world, and the network through which everything stands in relation to every other phenomenon, and for that reason is able to stand forth as what it is presented. So in this way then, Heidegger is suggesting that art is not representational ultimately. And we can tease out of this then another critique, and we've examined several so far, of the mimetic theory of art. It is not imitation. A different word for to imitate would be to represent. So artworks aren't artworks insofar as they represent or imitate something. That is some content in relatively true or false, accurate or inaccurate ways. In other words, artworks are not about something. And so this speaks to his critique of hylomorphism as one interpretation of the thing. That is a structured relation of form and matter. So for example, you have, let's say, the form of musical composition, and then the content of that would be some series of feelings or ideas, perhaps, that the artist would want to express. But maybe that artist could take that same thematic content, those feelings and ideas, and represent or express them through painting or through sculpture or through dance or whatever else. In this translation from one medium or genre to the next, along the lines of representation theory in the arts, we wouldn't really be losing anything. There would be no energy loss. But that's exactly what Heidegger is suspicious of, what he's sort of challenging here. To make a work of art is not to comment on something, but it's rather to contribute to the very poetic construction of the world, such that the world shows itself in a profoundly new and perhaps discomforting or disturbing way. Okay. So artworks are, so the very work being, when you say that this is an artwork and as such it's working, it's doing something as an artwork, well, the being of artworks are in such a way, then, this is again a kind of big picture orientation to Heidegger's approach. They are in such a way that they amount to a kind of disruption, to a shocking of the consumer or the viewer of the art out of more or less ordinary ways of doing, seeing, and evaluating. So our basic concept and orientation to value is undermined or challenged or reworked in the context of the working of the work. And so how does this happen? Well, every work of art then is a kind of force field, a field of forces. So not force field in the science fiction sense of like an invisible barrier, but a field of forces like in physics, for example, where there is a dynamic field of the exchange of forces such that if a new object or element or entity is introduced to it, it can be transformed or changed, even if it's not directly touched, as it were, by another object within the field. So you take a work of art, whether it's a painting or a song or a work of architecture or a bit of sculpture or a dance, you take this as the work, and you can take anything else, any thought, any experience, any image, any idea from outside of the work in the course of everyday reality, and you put it into the force field that's generated by the work itself, and it's suddenly transformed. It's now issued in a new light. It now takes on a new sense, a new meaning. And importantly, this can help to shake up or undermine the entrenched obviousness of our ordinary and extraordinary relations to other individuals and to other things in the world, such to facilitate new relations that perhaps we never saw as possible, thus giving us possibilities to create brand new worlds. Does that make sense? Are there any questions so far? Any comments? Let me check the chat. Oh, okay. Raven was talking about Anthropocene, so okay. Let's go on here. So now we're going to get into the text. So there are a few sections, and this is the untitled section with which Heidegger begins, and so I'm just calling it the introduction. So we're dealing with a work that has the title, The Origin of the Work of Art. What is the origin of the work of art? That's the question. What is the Ursprung? So what is the ursprünglich character, the originary character of artworks? Well, on page 650, he defines for us what he means. So origin, Ursprung here, means that from and by which something is what it is and as it is. What something is, as it is, we call its essence or nature. The origin of something is the source of its nature. The question concerning the origin of the work of art asks about the source of its nature. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out what the source of the nature of art is as a phenomenon with which we are all more or less familiar, either intellectually in our basic apprehension of the existence of phenomena that we call art, or vividly experientially in our love of such entities or experiences. So origin as Ursprung is the originary source of something. And this is what we're talking about at the very beginning, which as source is never left behind. It stays with the thing throughout its stages of unfolding into becoming what it is. So again, conjure up the image of a mountain spring whose origin is hidden beneath the rocks, but which nevertheless, even if obscured, continues to replenish the water as it springs forth. And then essence. So when we're asking about the origin of something, we're asking about what something is in its essence. Well, Wesen, that's the German noun for essence, but that comes from an older German verb, Wesen, which is spelled slightly differently, that means to be. So then the essence of a thing, so to be in the infinitive sense. So the essence of a thing is the manner in which it shows itself and abides as what it is, not eternally. So we're not dealing with these sort of abstract, universal, Platonic forms, but in and through time. So essences, we're not thinking them platonically. Essences can change in this or that moment. And so the determination of a thing's essence is made in part by the historical decision of how it is that we are to approach or understand such things that come to presence. So let's see. So for further clarity, I mentioned there is a German verb in everyday usage now. It's just a simple term, anwesend, and that literally means to come to presence or to appear. So anwesend is for something to appear. And then turning that into a noun, Anwesenheit means simply presence. The an, though, of Anwesenheit, as is depicted in the verbal form of anwesend, is active, right? So the idea here is even if something is just sitting there available for your perception, like this coffee cup on my desk, there is a moment in which it comes to show itself as what it is. But it's so obvious, it's so familiar that that moment is typically eclipsed. I don't think about it. I simply am gripped by the meaning of this thing in my immediate presence as a coffee cup. But that's only because we live in a society in which coffee cups are normal. But has anyone seen the older film from the 70s, The Gods Must Be Crazy? Has anybody seen that? Well, there's one important part of it where someone's flying over somewhere in Australia, I think it is. It's been a long time since I've seen it.
I think it's in Africa.
Oh, is it in Africa? I thought it was. Okay.
Yeah.
You could be
It
right.
took me a minute to jog my memory, but the Coke bottle from the plane.
Yeah. And so an indigenous person finds this bottle and brings it back to the tribe. And none of them, of course, are familiar with such things. They don't know what Coke is. They don't know what a soft drink bottle is. Yet it shows itself as meaningful in some way, and they end up having to interpret it. Right? So the question that for us is immediately answered without thought is left open because of a comparable condition or state of being that's defined by strangeness and unfamiliarity. Okay, so then this is what we were talking about earlier. The obvious answer to the question is, what is the origin, understood in this way, of the work of art? The obvious answer is that the work originates from the artist. So what is the origin of the artist then? So when trying to figure out what a work of art is, we point then to the artist. So we say something that wasn't just naturally formed, but was deliberately created. It was made by an individual named an artist. So now we have to ask, well, what is the origin of the artist? In another slightly less obvious sense, the artist originates from the work. So that's what we were talking about earlier. If you want to know who the artist is, well, the artist is the person who makes artworks. So if you have someone that is rumored to be identified as an artist, yet they have produced no works of art, you might say, well, it's not an art. You're not an artist. This person's not an artist. You're only an artist if you produce art. So I'm just reminded of what Billy Crystal says in Throw Mama from the Train, if anybody's seen that. A writer writes. So a writer who has never written anything is not a writer. And the same we could say about an artist. So we call a person an artist only insofar as they produced art. So now we find ourselves in a circle. But he points out, this is not what we call in logic a vicious circle, in which case the conclusion of an argument is also the premise, which is supposed to be supporting the conclusion. So that's logical vicious circularity. That's not what we're dealing with here. It's instead the very space which we have to navigate thoughtfully in an ever deepening spiral. So this relates to the discipline of hermeneutics, that is the study of interpretation. And so one major problem in hermeneutics has been the so-called Hermeneutic Circle. Now, according to this problem, so just take something like a paragraph. So you can take any paragraph that you want, including one of my own that I've written here. So to understand what this paragraph means, you have to first understand what the sentence means, right? So if I ask you, what does the paragraph mean as a whole? You need to understand what the individual parts that make up the whole mean. So you can't understand the whole unless you understand the parts. Yet, you don't really understand this sentence. The obvious answer is that the work of art originates from the artist. You don't really understand that sentence until you see how it fits into the overall whole of the paragraph, right? So to understand the whole, you need to be familiar with the part that contributes to the whole. But to really know exactly what the part is contributing, you need to have a grasp of the whole. So interpretation of a text or of some phenomenon that we experience out there in the world is always a matter of navigating spirally between parts and whole. And notice how you could even do the same with the sentence, leaving the paragraph alone. So to understand what the sentence means, the obvious answer is that the work of art originates from the artist. You need to know what obvious means. You need to know what answer means, originates. You need to know what the individual words mean. But again, to know what the individual word is doing structurally, formally, within the whole of the expression, you need to understand the whole of the expression. So you're constantly, in your effort to interpret, moving from whole to part to whole. And that's what he suggests we do in order to trace out the third term that brings together artist and artwork, and that would be art itself, Kunst. So the space down into which our thought must spiral is art itself, spiraling between the limits of artist and artwork. So both artwork and artist in their reciprocal relation are originated in and by art. But art is not something that sits independently of and prior to actual works of art. So there's not this thing that we're coming to define or understand as art, and then individuals that we call artists who produce works. This is the sense of a priori that Croce mentioned. So I can talk about art only because there are works, and I can talk about artworks only because there are art. And I can tease apart conceptually what's going on in each of these determinations, but conceptually means here abstractly. Concretely, there is no art without an artwork, and there is no artwork without art. And for that relation to hold, there must be the artist, who occupies yet a different role altogether that's necessarily related to the other two. So it's not something that exists independently. To know art, we have to go to actual works. So to know what art is, we need to examine works of art and question the work of them. So what they're doing by listening to them, not by taking a presupposed stance as to what art is and then approaching something that by perhaps rumor we have been brought to believe constitutes a work of art, and then on the basis of that prior understanding making sense of and interpreting it. We need to go to existing works of art without any assumptions, to the extent that that's possible, and simply listen to what they say in order to gain a more originary clue as to what's going on in art quite generally. But where do we begin? And this is what brings us to confront the problem of thingness or thingliness. So where do we start? Well, every work, if we're talking about a book of poems, a painting, a sculpture, some architectural building, a musical recording that's been preserved on vinyl or CD or MP3 or whatever, all of these have in some sense, a thingly character. So then works of art are things. But now we have to ask then, well, what the fuck is a thing? So in order to, and this is to quote the text, in order to arrive at the immediate and full reality of the work of art, which will then permit us to, quote, discover the real art within it, or also within it. And this, I mentioned parenthetically, announces Heidegger's ontological approach. That is to say, we're trying to discover the real art within every individual work of art as such. So disclosing the reality here of the being of art. It turns out that we have to investigate what it means in general to be a thing. But he says, even if we focus on aesthetic experience, so this musical recording, so if I go and listen to a Jimi Hendrix song or something on Spotify, so if I'm engaging with an MP3 file or a WAV file or whatever it might be, I think it's actually a WAV file that you stream in that way. But if you're listening to the song, we wouldn't say that you're really engaging with the thing as a digital object. Just like if I put on a vinyl record at home, I'm not really, when I'm listening to the music, I'm not engaging with the thingliness of the vinyl. So what's really at issue there is the experience, right? The aesthetic experience. So this is what Croce thinks. Remember when he says, strictly speaking, if we're looking at a painting or listening to a piece of music that has been preserved on some physical medium or whatever, when we talk about the art at play, we're really engaging with the product of mentation, of cognition, of intellect, of thought. So we're dealing with consciousness. So that's the sense in which Croce is very much Hegelian. So then, according to approach on the part of figures like Croce and Hegel, to address the thingliness of the art object would be to misunderstand what is art. But Heidegger's response to that is, okay, even if we do take seriously the aesthetic experience of art as what's really going on, the thingly character of art objects cannot be denied. It is there. So he says there's something stony in the work of architecture. There's something wooden in a wood carving, colored in a painting. There's something spoken, so sonorous, in a linguistic work. Sonorous in the sense of the verbal articulation. And then when it comes to musical composition, there's a different sense of the sonorous at play. And these thingly aspects of the work, even if we think that they are secondary or inferior to the experiential consciousness aspect, are nevertheless essential. So they have to be recognized. And yes, we are going to get out of here in just a few minutes, but here's where he takes us through the 3 standard interpretations. That is standard in terms of the history of this Western intellectual tradition. And so all 3 of these ways, according to Heidegger, end up doing violence, end up constituting a kind of measured assault on the real nature of the thing. In the German, das Ding. I love that word. But the first is the thing as hypokeimenon. And so that's the substratum or the bearer of qualities from the Greek philosophical tradition. So from Aristotle. So the hypokeimenon gets translated to subjectum in the Latin, and that literally means what underlies or supports properties or qualities, which are accidens in this Latin metaphysical framework, this Roman metaphysical system. So then this coffee cup is ultimately, in terms of its status as a thing, it is the subjectum, the subject, the hypokeimenon, which as a kind of hidden premise, or excuse me, presence, is bearing a series of qualities or properties. So the visual quale of the whiteness, the tactile quale of the smooth texture and the solidity of the material object, the auditory quale of what's produced if I tap on it, and so forth. What is the thing is that which holds and makes possible and brings into a kind of essential relationship all of these various qualities or predicates. Okay, but I'm actually going to stop sharing there because I want to show you before we go, and we'll pick up on these 3 different approaches to thingness at the beginning of class next time. I wanted to show you a couple of images, well, just one image before we go. So who here is familiar with Andy Warhol, maybe his Brillo box sculptures? Has anybody seen those? So here's an image. So I think it was in I want to say 1964, or it might be 1968. I'll have to double check. That Andy Warhol took on this exhibition of Brillo boxes. So Brillo, I don't think that company exists anymore, but in the mid 20th century and early 20th century, it was a popular purveyor of soap, pads, cleaning products, sponges, and so forth. So the Brillo pad was a common domestic tool that would be found in more or less every American household. And so what's going on here? Did Andy Warhol just collect over time a bunch of these Brillo boxes that were created for the transportation of this salable good, this commodity? No. He created every one of these boxes. He specifically, as an artist, produced afresh, every one of these boxes, precisely reproducing in a way that would be entirely impossible to distinguish these capitalist commodities, right? But why would he do that? Well, Heidegger allows us, through his sort of phenomenological, ontological approach to the nature of art, he allows us to make sense of this. So we ordinarily, when walking through a grocery store or Costco or something, where you can see such items available for sale in bulk, we wouldn't really pay any attention to these. We're simply going shopping because we have particular needs, domestic needs, and we're going to make purchases in accordance with them. And in that activity, the very object, that is the very things, and the thingliness of the things gets lost. It gets rendered invisible, more or less. So Warhol is then taking what is forgotten, what is obscured and ignored ultimately, owing to its everydayness and its profound familiarity. He's taking that and rendering it extraordinary for us in a different context. So he can take something that has a certain sense, a certain interpretive direction to it, and by transporting it into a new domain, one that we might describe in terms of the aesthetic, he effects a profound transformation of the everyday, and of thus a kind of relationship that we have to other human beings and to other objects within the scope of these everyday cultural and social structures as the very pathways of presence that come together and constitute the world as we know it. And so world will be a very important concept that Heidegger sets up against another concept, the earth, that will be at the center of our discussion for Thursday. And then when we say then, along Heideggerian lines, that the work of art sets up the coming into truth of the being of beings, what goes on there is a kind of conflict or tension that's preserved in the work itself between world and earth. And we'll use this example of the Brillo boxes and some other examples too to make sense of what's going on here next time. But are there any questions before we go? But is this stuff making some sense?
Some sense, yeah. I like how you kind of clarified what his conclusion is from the second half, because just reading the first half, it's really like you kind of get left hanging. Like
Right.
you now have the prerequisite information to move on and then come to a conclusion, but you really haven't gotten anywhere substantive yet.
Yeah, and so that sort of shaking up of the ordinary is going to be, it turns out, what the work quality or the work being of the work of art does, as opposed to the equipment being of equipment, which we find ourselves in our consciousness kind of dissolved into, such that if you're a carpenter making a house with a hammer, the hammer is a tool or a piece of equipment that you're not thematically aware of. You're simply swinging it. You're not aware of it. Or to use the example of Van Gogh's peasant shoes, when the peasant wears those shoes to toil in the field, she's not aware of them as equipment. The equipmentality of the shoes is such that it disappears in the use. And so he's going to set that up as something different from the work of the work. And that's why he uses specifically the Van Gogh painting of the shoes. So we'll talk about that next time. All right, guys. So are there any final questions? I'm sorry I ended up keeping you basically the whole time. But all right, I hope you're doing okay in these last couple of weeks, and I look forward to our conversation on Thursday. So I'll see you guys then.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.